Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating and pivotal era in American history, the Gilded Age and the huge wave of reform that came right after it. And this right here really nails the whole idea. Gilded Age, it's all about rapid economic growth, but you've also got this dark underbelly of corruption and inequality. It's a perfect paradox, a shiny golden surface hiding some really serious problems underneath. So that brings us to the big questions, right? How on earth did America change so much, so fast? And what was the real price of all that progress? That's what we're going to dig into. All right, let's start by setting the scene for America's Gilded Age. We're talking about a time of just explosive change, from about 1870 all the way to 1900. Okay, and this timeline, wow. It really shows you just how fast everything happened. I mean, in just a few decades right after the Civil War, the entire country was like fundamentally rewired. You have the Transcontinental Railroad finishing up in 1869, stitching the coasts together. And then bam, almost overnight you get these corporate giants popping up, Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, and they're creating a totally new economic world. So you gotta ask, what was fueling this incredible engine of industry? What made this kind of crazy, unprecedented growth even possible? Well, it was basically a perfect storm. First, the U.S. was sitting on a mountain of natural resources: coal, iron, oil, you name it. Then you had all these game-changing new technologies like steel and electricity and the telephone, completely transforming everyday life. The railroads were the arteries, connecting everything into one giant market. And of course, you had banks and Wall Street pumping in the cash to make it all happen. And a huge piece of the puzzle was the government's attitude. They had this policy called laissez-faire, which basically means hands-off. They weren't putting a lot of rules or regulations on businesses. And that gave these huge corporations a ton of freedom to grow and expand at a pace that was just staggering. But there's always a but, isn't there? This kind of wild, unchecked growth came with a really heavy price tag. It created a whole new set of social and economic problems that were, well, about to boil over. One of the biggest issues was the rise of monopolies, or what they called trusts. You had single companies, think John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil, that could take over an entire industry. They'd just crush any competition, which meant they could jack up prices to whatever they wanted. And this led to a huge debate, one we're kind of still having today. Were these guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller, were they robber barons? Ruthless businessmen who got rich by exploiting workers and using corrupt tactics? Or were they captains of industry, brilliant innovators who built America, created jobs, and gave back through philanthropy? It's a tough question. And take a look at this. This picture really gets to the heart of it. This is the human cost. This isn't some fancy mansion on Fifth Avenue. No, this is what life was like for the millions of people who poured into the cities looking for work. See, people were just flooding into the cities for those factory jobs. But the cities, they just couldn't handle it. They grew way too fast. The infrastructure, sanitation, housing, it couldn't keep up. So you ended up with these incredibly overcrowded and filthy apartment buildings called tenements, where disease could just rip through the population. So who was working in all these new factories? Well, it was a huge wave of what people at the time called new immigrants. As you can see from the map, they were coming mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were the absolute backbone of this new industrial workforce. But they showed up here only to face some really intense prejudice and a lot of hardship. It was not an easy welcome. Yeah, this led to a pretty nasty backlash called nativism. It was an anti-immigrant movement, really fueled by fear and prejudice. The basic idea was that native-born Americans were superior. And this wasn't just talk. It led to actual discriminatory laws, like the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, so you've got all these problems piling up, right? Corporate greed, terrible poverty in the cities, social tensions. The pressure is just building and building. And into this scene steps a new kind of hero, someone ready to drag all this ugliness into the light. And that hero was the journalist. They were called muckrakers, and their weapon was investigative journalism. They used writing and even the new technology of photography to expose the dirty secrets hiding behind that glittering, gilded surface. And they weren't just trying to sell papers. Their mission, their real goal, was to inspire actual reform. And just look at the impact they had. It was incredible. You had Jacob Riis, whose photos of life in the tenements were so shocking they actually led to new housing and sanitation laws. You had the unbelievably brave Ida B. Wells, who exposed the horror of lynching and helped kickstart the civil rights movement. There was Ida Tarbell, whose deep dive on Standard Oil was a key reason that monopoly got broken up. And, of course, Upton Sinclair. His book, The Jungle, was so disgusting it was about the meatpacking industry. It horrified the whole country and led directly to the first major food safety laws. So, you see, the muckrakers did way more than just sell newspapers. They lit a fire under the country. They fueled this huge nationwide movement for change that we now call the Progressive Era. And at its heart, progressivism was all about one core idea, a total rejection of that hands-off, laissez-faire attitude. Progressives said, no way. They believed the government actually should step in, that it had a responsibility to solve the big problems caused by industrialization, everything from monopoly power to worker safety. And here's the thing. It worked. This movement wasn't just talk. They got major laws passed. The Sherman Antitrust Act went after monopolies. The Pure Food and Drug Act made sure our food was safe. They completely changed the relationship between the government, the people, and big business. And it wasn't just about business and safety. The progressives also wanted to make the government more democratic. The 17th Amendment is a perfect example. Before this, state politicians picked the U.S. senators, and those politicians were often in the pockets of big corporations. This amendment gave the power to elect senators directly to the voters, a huge shift. But maybe the longest and toughest fight of all was the battle for women's right to vote. Just look at this timeline. This wasn't some quick win. We're talking about a 72-year struggle. It was a grueling, generation-spanning fight that started way back in 1848, even before the Gilded Age really kicked off. And this quote, it says it all. It's from the very beginning of the movement, and it intentionally echoes the Declaration of Independence. All men and women are created equal. What a powerful statement. It was a radical idea for the time, that the founding principles of the nation had to apply to everyone, not just the men. So when you step back and look at it, this whole era was this incredible journey from a gilded society to a progressive one. It totally reshaped America, and it left us with reforms that are still part of our lives today. But, and this is the big takeaway, it also left us with some really big questions. Questions about inequality, the power of corporations, and what the government's role should be. And honestly, those questions feel just as important and urgent today as they did over 100 years ago.